Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. My name is Matteo Vergani, and I'm thrilled to chair this fantastic session on extremists online ecosystem. The session links very well with Professor Maura Conway's excellent keynote. You will be able to read all the presenters' bios in the conference program on the AVERT website. So for the sake of brevity, we will go straight into the paper presentations. Dr. Ryan Scrivens, assistant professor at Michigan State University, will present the first paper co-authored with Dr. Tiana Gaudette, Professor Thomas Holt from Michigan State University, and Professor Maura Conway from Dublin City University. Over to you, Ryan.
All right. Perfect. Thanks everybody for joining us today for what is looks like will be an interesting panel. I'll just start off with a quick joke. I feel like I'm like the opening act for Professor Conway. I'm not sure how I'm going second after her, but at any rate, the title of this talk is Emerging Trends in Right-Wing Extremist Use of the Internet and Associated Technologies. So what I'm going to be doing here is summarizing the emerging trends in the empirical literature on right-wing extremist use of the internet and associated technologies. How we've divided these trends up or organized them, we've organized them into 5 core uses identified by Conway over 15 years ago, which include information provision, networking, recruitment, financing, and information gathering. And highlighted throughout this presentation will be the key gaps in the empirical literature and suggestions for progressing research. This presentation is derived from an edited piece we have, or a piece from an edited collection that should be coming out later this year. If anybody's interested in it now, send me an email and I'll send it to you. So the first one is information provision. So researchers have found that violent extremists and terrorists, including those with extreme right views, have been undeniably quick to adopt and use every emerging online platform to their disposal to spread propaganda and further their movement's objectives. Research also suggests that the advent of the internet has provided right-wing extremists, amongst others, with a medium in which they can disseminate rhetoric relatively unimpeded to a larger audience than ever before, and through any combination of communication outlets. It can range from spreading hatred on hate propaganda using explicit extremist sites, to cloaked sites, to sharing disinformation via communications to radicalize, mobilize, and strengthen activism, to engaging in cyber fear by uploading manifestos prior to acts of violence, all the way to utilizing cyberspace as a platform to attack computer systems to spread hateful propaganda. Here, the empirical research on the spread of online right-wing extremist propaganda has largely focused on propaganda found on websites and web forums, oftentimes differentiating between content aimed at insiders versus outsiders, something I'll just very briefly discuss later on. But in an effort to generate new empirically based knowledge on right-wing extremist propaganda, a growing emphasis has been placed on how a newer generation of right-wing extremists are using 1, mainstream social media platforms, and 2, lesser known and or dark social platforms. So the first, mainstream social media. So while researchers acknowledge that the racist old guard continues to maintain its presence on traditional spaces, i.e. Web forums, and in some cases websites, a majority of recent empirical research is exploring a newer generation of adherents. Although they are familiar with the use of websites and online forums, but in particular, the emerging evidence base is starting to look at how these newer generations use digital platforms that they're more familiar with, including the likes of Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Nonetheless, there's been comparatively less research or attention directed at right-wing extremist use of Facebook compared to Twitter, due at least in part to much more public nature of Twitter than Facebook. And as a result, we're seeing more focus on the public group or individual Facebook pages of right-wing extremists. This seems to be slowly changing, albeit in a post-Cambridge Analytica context in which researchers' access to Facebook data is getting more difficult, unfortunately. Similarly, research on right-wing extremist propaganda found on YouTube, a platform that has been described by some as a radicalizing machine for the far right, is almost exclusively focused on individual users as the main protagonists of right-wing extremist cyberspaces. Fortunately, there's been some research, not a lot, on particularly looking at YouTubers' recommendation system to facilitate the spread of right-wing extremist content, but much more research is needed in this regard. Moving on to the lesser known and dark social. So some empirical work is examining more fringe spaces and the type of right-wing extremist content hosted there. This content often takes a visual form, something that Maura was talking about earlier, and its increased appearance in dark social spaces due, at least in part, to increased takedown of right-wing extremist content by major platforms. So here, the fringe platforms trafficked by right-wing extremists are often sorted broadly of two sorts. The first, dedicated right-wing extremist forums, spaces who I'm sure you've heard of, like Gab, and then the general platforms with dedicated right-wing extremist boards, or boards that have essentially been hijacked or colonized by right-wing extremists such as Reddit and 4chan and others. So in addition, the right-wing extremist internet scene, and importantly, is distributed beyond high-profile platforms. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir right now. It includes a selection of relatively new and highly accessible communication apps. Many of these fit into the category of so-called dark social networks. So what we're referring to here, it's not the dark nature of the content necessarily, but the difficulty of researching content shared via messaging apps and other forms of encrypted chat, for example, Telegram and Discord. These difficulties at least partially explain why less research has been conducted on right-wing extremist use of these spaces and apps than may be warranted. And in addition, the relative newness and niche nature of some of these platforms may be another explanation for why there's not a lot of research on these spaces. Fortunately, there has been some research conducted, particularly looking at right-wing extremist misinformation, work by folks at ISD. They've looked at Telegram and they've also looked at Discord, but there's a lot more research that needs to be done in this regard. Moving on to networking. So researchers have overwhelmingly found that violent extremists and terrorists generally, and right-wing extremists particularly, communicate in coordinated and decentralized all-channel manner. This allows for linking subgroups and external organizations from around the world to central online spaces such as web forums, blogs, and social media sites quickly and cheaply. Here, much of the research focus has been on examining the link between right-wing extremist networking online and 1, transnational connections, 2, trigger events or galvanizing events, and 3, the presence of different communities across platforms. First, the transnational, in particular, looking across platforms. So empirical work on right-wing extremist online network has largely explored the extent and scope of communication networks, primarily on websites and forums. But more recent efforts have been made to assess the formation of right-wing communities on platforms such as YouTube. There's not a lot of work, but there's some emerging, fortunately, as well as establishing or estimating the volume of right-wing extremist content within specific right-wing extremist networks on Twitter. In terms of transnational across organizations, empirical work has largely explored the transnational link and exchange between far and extreme right organizations and movements, with the most recent efforts looking at transnational links found on social media. Davey and colleagues, for example, at ISD found that the Canadian right-wing extremist channels, pages, groups, and accounts reached over 11 million domestic and international users across various social media platforms. On the other hand, Florio and Ganesh found that transnational exchanges on Twitter between far-right organizations in France, Germany, Italy, and the UK was only moderate. So in other words, what they found was that activity for each of these particular organizations within particular nations stayed within borders largely. So we're kind of seeing this disconnect in the research. Having said all of this, much more comparative research is needed. In this case, for example, to explore the extent to which transnational exchanges between far-right differ than those from the extreme right. Trigger events. Some empirical work, although in its infancy, but it seems to be gaining traction, has considered the impact of trigger or galvanizing events on the development of hateful content or right-wing extremist networks online, such as the effect of riots, the effect of rallies, the effect of presidential election results, and the effect of terrorist attacks. Like I said, this work is in its infancy, and I would argue that more work needs to be done here. And lastly, looking at the presence across platforms. This seems to be kind of a hot area of research right now. And obviously, given that right-wing extremists are maintaining their presence on multiple online platforms, more recent efforts have been made for comparative analyses across these platforms. There's not a lot of work, but we seem to be gaining some momentum in the space, such as the work of Davey and Ebner. They've explored the convergence of the new extreme right on in Europe and the US on 4chan, 8chan, Vote, Gab, and Discord. Zanetu and colleagues measured the spread of anti-Semitic content on 4chan and Gab. Colleague and co-author of this paper, Holt and colleagues examined the ideological sentiment expressed across various right-wing extremist forums. And myself and colleagues recently quantified the existence of extremist ideologies, personal grievances, and violent extremist mobilization mobilization efforts found within violent right-wing extremist forums, Iron March and Fascist Forge. Together, these studies highlight the connected nature of right-wing extremist movements, as well as some distinctions in their online communications, both within and across platforms. But regardless, and as I was hinting at before, this emerging evidence base remains in its infancy and requires further exploration. Moving along to recruitment. So research suggests that to raise awareness and convince individuals to join an extremist group or movement, violent extremists and terrorists, including right-wing extremists, use the internet to increase the possibility of interacting with potential recruits, as well as roam online spaces looking for potential recruits, usually the young folks. Research in this space, much of which has typically focused on dedicated hate sites and forums, suggests that right-wing extremist recruitment materials tend to fall into one of two categories. One, distributing disturbing or graphic text, images, or videos. If you look on your screen here, you can see an Atomwaffen campaign. It's relatively, I didn't put anything too vile, but some of the content that they post is questionable at best. And research suggests that this material is largely posted for the insiders, people who are already interested in or part of these groups. And then on the other hand, something that I'm particularly interested in is this more subtle material, largely for outsiders. You can see on your screen here, I'd argue that Breitbart is at least a far right quote unquote news channel. And there's a whole array of materials used by the extreme or far right to try to present their message in a more palatable manner, and oftentimes for recruitment purposes. But regardless of the recruitment material types, research suggests that right-wing extremists have attempted to recruit via eye-catching and visually appealing content. This is often in multimedia format, featuring audio files, digital videos, interactive chats, bulletin boards, cyber cafes, and web pages featuring video games, music, technology, art, dating advice, you name it, so on and so forth. A visual turn in research is also now apparent, something that Maura was kind of alluding to or discussing earlier. Due to the humor and sarcastic memes being used by right-wing extremists to spread propaganda online to a more mainstream audience and for the larger purpose of recruiting new adherents. But it's important to keep in mind that right-wing extremist humor and their use of sarcasm to poke fun at adversaries is not new by any means. I mean, the KKK were doing it back in the 20s. In terms of thinking about the online space, racist cartoons were a central component of various propaganda efforts found on then popular right-wing extremist forums back in the early 2000s. But what is new are right-wing extremists heavily co-opting of meme culture. So memes, which are widely popular online still, can take a variety of forms, including catchphrases, easy to digest caption images, and quirky animated GIFs. Research in this space has found that memes, particularly those expressing anti-Muslim sentiment, and I'd argue now we're probably seeing a shift or a little more of a focus on those perceived as part of an Asian community as a result of COVID, for example, are being used by right-wing extremists as a rally cry and a strategy for recruitment, including on spaces like Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, 4chan, and Gab. Here, the general consensus is that easy to digest caption images are increasingly popular amongst the younger generation of right-wing extremists. So in light of this emerging evidence base, future research is needed to better understand, one, why such propaganda is so popular amongst the younger generation of right-wing extremist adherents, and two, whether the use of humor and sarcasm represents the future of right-wing extremist recruitment efforts, especially on an international scale. Moving to financing, the fourth. I have this one and one left, and I'm still good on time, it looks like. Due to its immediate, interactive, and global reach, the internet has greatly increased the potential for extremists and terrorists to raise funds for their activities. However, and this is a big point here, very little research has emerged on how violent extremists, including the extreme right, has attempted to raise funds online. But of the limited empirical research in this regard, researchers generally suggest that funds are raised via, for their activities via one, merchandise sales, and two, donation solicitation. So for the first one, merchandise sales, research here suggests that right-wing extremists will sell a wide variety of extremist merchandise online to support a particular group or movement. Here, close research attention has been paid to merchandise sales through quote unquote shop pages found on dedicated extremist sites. But how, and I guess this is an important point here, the extent to which this content is sold and the volume of the merchandise found is unclear. We really don't have a good sense of the content being sold, whether a lot of the content's sold, and so on and so forth. And I think that's an area of research for the future. But moving beyond dedicated extremist websites that sell extremist merchandise, some recent reports suggest the right-wing extremists have exploited popular online retailers and marketplaces to sell merchandise to raise funds for their activities. Southern Poverty Law Center, for example, reported that hate groups advertise qualifying Amazon products on their websites to earn a commission of up to 10% on their sales. And some journalists have also reported that members of Atomwaffen, a violent right-wing extremist terrorist cell, if you will. They raise funds for selling Siege, which is a book that formed the basis of the group's ideology, on Amazon's Create Space. Importantly, though, is that research suggests that such sales made online on online retailers and marketplaces are unlikely to generate a significant amount of funding for a group or their movement. And I'd suggest looking at the work of Jessica Davis or the work of the name slipped my mind, Megan Squire. However, merchandise sales do enable the spread of extremist messaging and serve to keep propaganda available to new recruits, as well as maintain a network of like-minded individuals. In terms of donation solicitations, so empirical research, although very limited in scale, suggests that crowdfunding and peer-to-peer direct transactions are amongst the most popular or most common method that right-wing extremists use to solicit donations. Maura, for example, found that right-wing extremist groups Indiegogo campaign raised about half of the funds needed to place anti-Islam advertisements on 100 buses in NYC. The Anti-Defamation League similarly found that crowdfunding platforms such as GoFundMe or Kickstarter have enabled right-wing extremists to solicit donations from things such as projects or products or just general support. Research also suggests that peer-to-peer direct transactions in the form of cryptocurrencies, largely Bitcoin, have become a popular method of right-wing extremists to send and transfer money, largely because it is anonymous and it's relatively easy to use. And this is especially the case for those facing concerns about being deplatformed from sites using traditional payment procedures. So while this work sheds light on right-wing extremists' use of the internet for financing purpose, the evidence base remains incredibly thin and requires much more attention. So moving on to the last, information gathering. So given that the internet contains an overwhelming amount of information, violent extremists and terrorists can, amongst many other things, collect intelligence on specific targeting opportunities, learn about anti-terrorism measures, and share online training manuals about how to make bombs, how to plan assassinations, and how to avoid surveillance, amongst other things. And notably, the relatively anonymous and private nature of the internet has enabled them to strategize and execute their objectives with little risk of being apprehended by law enforcement officials or receive legal sanctions. And because of the availability of information on the internet, violent extremists and terrorists can open source search documents for information about potential targets. Some empirical research, although very limited, suggests that Google Earth, as just an example, is a useful tool for choosing and planning how to attack a target. But like the empirical research on how violent extremists and terrorists in general, and right-wing extremists in particular, attempt to raise funds online, very, very, very little is empirically known about how such individuals gather information. Of the limited work that is available, researchers have generally unpacked how information is gathered via information sharing, which is more general online information collection, and data mining, which consists of collecting and assembling information about specific targets and opportunities online. I'm just going to go through a couple slides here just so I can get to the key takeaways here. So putting this all together, what does this all mean? So what I've done here is I've highlighted in a very short period of time, I've covered a lot of literature, a lot of areas, several key emerging trends in the empirical literature on right-wing extremist use of the internet and associated technology. But much more work is needed in a lot of different areas, especially the empirical literature on the link between financing and information gathering. By no means am I saying that this is every single trend in right-wing extremist use of the internet. We're going to talk about other things in the subsequent presentations, as well as I hope we have some discussions in the Q&A about it. But we thought that it would be useful to share with you what we're seeing as the emerging trends. Second is that researchers who are exploring right-wing extremist use of the internet have typically focused their attention on dedicated hate sites and forums. That's because these spaces have been around longer than newer apps and social media sites and lesser known platforms. But as a result, the nature of right-wing extremist use of online platforms that are outside the mainstream have gone mostly unexplored by researchers. This is an important point here. There's generally no research on the extent to which right-wing extremists are cultivating expertise to utilize cyberspace as a platform to hack and or attack computer systems and data, i.e. cyber criminals. There's some work like my colleague Tom Holt, but a lot more work needs to be done. And lastly, little is known about the link between the on and offline worlds of violent extremists, whether it involves the extreme right or other extremist movements. And we can talk about this more in the Q&A. But last point is I hope that this presentation sparks interest amongst those working in the field to consider filling these gaps in the empirical literature. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Really great presentation. I enjoyed it very much, and I'm sure there will be a lot of questions. Our next speaker is Assistant Professor Braddock, who will present a paper co-authored with Brian Hughes, Beth Goldberg, and Cynthia Miller-Idriss. All the authors are based at the American University in Washington, DC. Over to you, Kurt.
Thanks very much, Matteo, and I just want to verify that you can hear me okay first before I continue to go on. All good? Okay, excellent. Yeah, so I'm gonna kind of narrow down from everything that we just heard. I can't imagine how much work must have went into what Ryan just covered. That was so much material, and this one we're gonna really boil down to one specific, I guess, facet of online activity and the implications it has for people being persuaded by far-right propaganda. This project, which is not technically in press yet, but should be in press very, very soon after submitting a second R&R. This project, entitled Engagement in Subversive Online Activity, predicts susceptibility to persuasion by far-right extremist propaganda. Interestingly enough, this project was an accident. This is not something that we mean to research. It's not anything that we intended to look for. It's not anything that we had been particularly thinking about. Some of the work that we're doing at the Polarization and Extremism Research Innovation Lab here at American University revolves around some of the work that I started doing about 2018 related to attitudinal inoculation and its tendency to prevent persuasion. Now, inoculation has been tested in preventing persuasion in the domains of health communication, more mainstream political communication, interpersonal communication. But in 2018, I decided to test it on far right and far left extremist propaganda. It turns out it worked there. I arrived at American University, and in partnering with Cynthia Miller-Idriss, we decided to take it a bit further and look at specific subdomains within far right propaganda that's pervasive in some of the online spaces that we've heard about, specifically related to race science or scientific racism, generally the belief that white individuals are biologically superior to any minority race, and male supremacy, which surrounds kind of the incel ideology and some of the ideas that we're seeing in the manosphere, guys, the organizations like MGTOW, the incels and those types. So we were doing these two projects. We organized these two projects in conjunction with a couple of partners, and everything's going fine as it does. We gathered data, and in gathering data, we incorporated some control variables into our analyses to see whether or not inoculation worked. One of them, two of them, were related to a general predilection for right-wing beliefs on the more extreme side, right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation, two variables I've used before, two variables I'm sure anybody who studies the far right is familiar with, but really just as a control, or to make sure that people's online activity wouldn't affect what we would get with respect to the effects of inoculation. We also had about 20 to 24 items related to online activity, what people were doing online. And this ranged from everything from using BitTorrents to social media to watching unboxing videos, which my nephew does endlessly for some reason I can't figure out. So there's these 24 different online activities that people can engage in, primarily surrounding social interaction, some not, but we only included them as controls. In looking at it and doing a factor analysis of those online activities, we found that there were 5 specific activities that clumped together in this one factor that we called subversive online activities, mainly for lack of a better term. Now, we had several ways that the factors overlap, but these five factors kept showing up in our analyses as significant predictors of our outcomes. And this is as a control variable. So I got to thinking, well, maybe we have something here. Maybe this little clump of 5 activities can actually predict whether or not people are susceptible to persuasion by this far-right propaganda that we're exposing them to, independent of whether or not we inoculate them or not. So from these 2 original inoculation studies, one related to male supremacy propaganda, one related to race science propaganda, we found this variable that was pretty interesting, and we decided to dig deeper into it. So the 5 activities that we found that clump together, and they kind of group together in 2 groups, because, and you'll see why in a second, but they do group together. We have doxing, so revealing other people's information online and kind of disseminating their private information without their consent, trolling other people, or deliberately starting fights with individuals online for the sake of entertainment or for kind of derailing a thread. Kind of unsurprisingly, engagement in a social engagement on what we call alt-right platforms or alt-tech platforms, things like Getter, Parler, and Gab, things like that, where kind of the new alt-right often congregates, organizes, and engages with other like-minded individuals. So these 3 make sense together. But then there were 2 other activities that many of us use every day or do every day that clump together with these 3 as well. One being encrypting our communication. And I mean, I use WhatsApp. I'm sure many of you use WhatsApp, but that fell into the factor that we found related to subversive online activity. And the other is the anonymization of one's communication online. So using different apps that can anonymize who you are when you engage in social interaction online. Now we can see that these 2 activities, the anonymization and the encryption of one's communication, those aren't necessarily problematic in and of themselves. I mean, like I said, I encrypt my communication every day when I use WhatsApp. But when in conjunction with these other kinds of activities, the doxing, the trolling, the use and engagement with these alt-tech platforms, it seems that they are actually indicative of a bigger problem or a bigger, let's say, collection of activities these individuals engage in. So we put together a factor using these 5 items. The reliability estimate for these 5 items was quite high, if memory serves, something like 0.91. And we decided to look at whether or not this factor was actually a significant predictor of the outcomes that we had tested when we're looking at whether or not inoculation would prevent persuasion. So here we were using inoculation as a control in these analyses, and instead looked at this as a predictor of the different outcomes that we were interested in. Now, those outcomes related to persuasion are, number 1, psychological reactance. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with psychological reactance, the best way to understand it is to give you an example, because it's something that we've all experienced. If you've ever been on a used car lot, or you've ever been at a mall and you're just trying to browse and shop, and a salesperson comes up to you and tries to persuade you to buy something, that weird negative feeling you get and you just want them to go away, that's psychological reactance. It's basically a negative arousal tendency when we think that our freedom to make our own decisions is being taken from us. And when we know somebody's trying to persuade us, we tend to feel that psychological reactance. So that's actually a negative predictor of persuasion. The more somebody feels reactance, the less they're being persuaded by a particular idea. The second is gratification, which is a tendency to feel happiness or satisfaction by exposure to a particular message. So the items in this scale, they measured the degree to which people felt positive emotions or felt satisfied when they were exposed to the extremist propaganda. The third is the degree to which the individual attributed credibility to the group that produced the propaganda. So whether the group behind the propaganda was related to race science or male supremacy, we wanted to see whether or not, if somebody was exposed to those propaganda items, that they would attribute credibility to those who authored them. And finally, support intention, the one that we're all really interested in. To what degree does exposure to messages translate to people being persuaded to support the group? And this scale was measured in terms of supporting a group ideologically, so sharing information on social media, logistically, things like hiding weapons for the group, financially, donating money to the group, and finally, armed support. Those 4 items all clump together into a good support intention scale. So we treated it as one item as well, or one scale as well. And those are the 4 major outcomes that we tested. I should note that reactance is actually the combination of anger and counter arguing. So in most of our analyses, we looked at those separately, but in the analyses I'm going to show, I'm going to treat psychological reactance as a second order factor, which is a predictable outcome when we model reactance in that fashion. So let's go to the different analyses. And what I'm showing you is the third of 3 different analyses we did. In addition to these analyses, which are regression estimates, we also performed just basic correlational analyses. And I also split people's subversive online activity tendency into tertiles, so low, medium, and high. And all of those largely follow suit with the results I'm going to discuss here with respect to the regression estimates. So what we're looking at here is the degree to which subversive online activity was a significant predictor of gratification. And as you see here, for both race science and male supremacy propaganda across both elements of far-right propaganda, subversive online activity, this factor that emerged while we were looking at other things, was the strongest predictor of whether somebody would feel gratification when they were exposed to that race science or male supremacy propaganda. For race science, social dominance orientation, one's race, and inoculation worked here as well. But given that we're looking at a regression estimate or a regression equation, those are parceled out of the variance with respect to SOA. But when we look at it in this way, we see that SOA, these activities, they are the strongest predictors in the model, in the optimal model for predicting gratification. For the statistics nerds out there, I will specify that all these models were estimated using backward entry, meaning we included all variables that we had in the study, and they were taken out one by one based on whether or not they were significant or not. So this is basically making a reduction sauce out of our predictors, and in that reduction sauce, we see that subversive online activity was the most potent predictor. Next, we move on to attribution of credibility. And again, we see that across race science and male supremacy, that subversive online activity factor is the most potent predictor of the attribution of credibility. Again, we see social dominance orientation and inoculation were significant predictors when we look at race science, and the 2 right-wing tendencies, the social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism, those appear for male supremacy. But again, this subversive online activity factor, it rises to the top. And again, it's the strongest predictor of credibility attribution for both types of right-wing propaganda. Then we look at support intention. And again, like the others, we're seeing subversive online activity is the strongest predictor of intention to support the source of the right-wing propaganda they were exposed to. We have a much bigger model when we look at race science relative to male supremacy. There's more involved, and luckily for us, we see that inoculation is there as well. So that boded well for our inoculation studies. But again, for our purposes here, it was no accident that SOA factor was emerging as a significant predictor, significant control variable in those analyses, because across the board, in all of these outcomes, we're seeing that it predicts whether somebody is persuaded by these kinds of propaganda. Now, I haven't mentioned reactance. And again, that's because reactance is a second order factor comprised of 2 first order factors, one being anger, one being counter arguing. So to predict that and to understand how these different variables relate to one another, I performed some structural equation modeling analyses on them to see kind of how these variables are structured together. Are the relationships between subversive online activity and the outcomes, are they direct relationships? Are they indirect relationships? How do we know how they work together? And this is where I hate to be hyperbolic, but my jaw dropped when I saw these 2. This is the race science structural model. Here we see that the relationship between subversive online activity and support intention, it's both indirect and direct. We can see paths from the different variables go through reactance to support intention, and we see there's also a significant direct effect here. What you're looking at are all standardized variable or standardized beta coefficients. So all of these are scaled from -1 to 1. So we see that all these variables, they interact in different ways. And as I'll show in a minute, there is a pretty interesting total effect of subversive online activity on the different outcomes. But this is what really surprised me. This is how the variables in the race science data group together. This is how the data group together when we look at male supremacy. The male supremacy propaganda, the structure of the variables was exactly the same, and the magnitude of the relationships is almost exactly the same. We had near perfect replication of our analyses looking at male supremacy relative to race science. And as I'll show on the next slide, we'll see that when we look at the total effects of this subversive online activity factor on the different outcomes. So what we're looking at is that first column, that SOA, then the numbers below it. We see that subversive online activity had a net negative effect on reactants, a standardized beta of 0.42. Support intention, what we're all interested in, 0.59. This is all of the direct effects added to all the indirect effects. So we see that across all of our outcome variables, all of our variables that relate to whether somebody is persuaded by the propaganda are significantly and strongly affected by the subversive online activity factor. So I don't have a side-by-side comparison here, but keep your mind about the magnitude of these different effects of SOA on these different outcomes. If we look at male supremacy, they are very, very comparable. Again, almost exactly the same. We have almost near replication of the size of the variables or the size of the effects and the direction of the effects. So I think that we have very strong indication here that engagement in these 5 activities is a strong predictor of persuadability by this kind of propaganda. Now, I want to be very careful to say that persuasiveness does not mean behavior. This is not us predicting that people who engage in these behaviors become terrorists. It shows that they are persuaded by this kind of propaganda, which is one risk factor for somebody becoming radicalized or going down a trajectory towards possible violence. So this is just another way to identify individuals who might be in trouble or might be vulnerable to persuasion by the kind of propaganda that would move somebody down a radicalization trajectory. So I will stop there to save time for my other panelists, but given all of the great stuff that Ryan has said and my collection of results here, I'm looking forward to your questions and talking to all of you about what we've got. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Kurt. Such an excellent presentation. I'm already getting questions for you, and it's really great. Our next speaker is Dr. Julian Droogan, who will present a paper co-authored with Lise Waldek, Brian Ballsun-Stanton, and Jade Hutchinson. The authors are based at Macquarie University in Sydney, and they are members of the AVERT network. Over to you, Julian.
Thank you very much, Matteo. I believe that you can see our shared screen up there in front of you all. And so it gives me enormous pleasure to be here and to be able to introduce a research project that we're engaged in at Macquarie University. This is a research project that is both cross-platform and also engages in large-scale empirical research in an attempt to try and better understand Australian far-right ecosystems. But as well as trying to understand the far right in Australia from an ecosystem perspective, we're also trying to do some conceptual work around how we can do these sorts of cross-platform, large-scale research into ecosystems and what sort of new frameworks or conceptual frames we can bring to this sort of empirical work in the future. And so, as we've heard already this morning a couple of times, the term ecosystem has become a very popular descriptor used by researchers, by CT and CVE practitioners to point to the complex intersections between violent extremism and these highly complex digital environments. We say that violent extremists inhabit an ecosystem of online digital platforms to spread propaganda, to recruit. ISIS or the Christchurch perpetrator harness and exploit online, again, ecosystems of platforms to frame and to broadcast and to extend and leverage their attacks. But how does this work? Drawing from the natural sciences as well as media and communication studies, scholars of online terrorism and violent extremism have sought to capitalize on the conceptual potential of ecology or ecosystem to try and sort of understand and in a few cases to map online environments and to better predict how violent extremists might move, or individuals or groups through these environments, how they socialize through these environments, and on occasion, how they also weaponize these environments. But in many ways, terrorism and violent extremism scholars are still in their infancy, I think, as Maura alluded to this morning, when they're exploring the benefits and also the limits of using ecosystem analogies and related concepts when they try to generate understandings of and also responses to violent extremism online. So this is particularly true when we're trying to consider the interaction of multiple social media platforms at one time. You know, we know that no one just dwells on or inhabits one platform, no group does. You know, even those that are condensed now into places like Telegram or Gab, they extend over many platforms. So this paper is an account of some recent work that we've been doing to create a conceptual framework for how violent extremist groups and movements interact with digital ecosystems. It's more than just how terrorists use the internet, though. I think this is really important. It's about how social movements that terrorists come out of are indeed co-created by and with the internet and the digital affordances and architecture that they inhabit. So in this presentation, we're going to draw on some data from two projects. The first was a grant that we received from the New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice to map the New South Wales right-wing extremist online environment following the Christchurch terror attack. And in this, we partnered with Deborah Smith, Mario Puka, and also Mohammed Iqbal from Victoria University. So we want to acknowledge their contribution as well. This project involved a multi-platform mixed methods approach, drawing on data collected from Facebook, 30 right-wing extremist Australian pages between 2011 and 19. From Gab, 1.3 million toots, as they call them, on Gab, from about 23,000 accounts that interacted with Australian Gab seed accounts that were associated with right-wing extremists. Also about 37,000 tweets from just over 3,000 users identified as being in New South Wales, also associated with far-right extremist Twitter accounts, and then a series of 4chan, 8chan, later 8kun, and Reddit Australia focused message boards. You know, and all of this data intersected across the period of time, really in 2019, for that period just after the Christchurch terror attack. Now, after collecting what was in effect a snapshot of a violent extremist ecosystem in operation, not complete, of course, but part of that ecosystem, we saw that we had the opportunity to look in a more conceptual fashion at how right-wing extremist narratives and themes and other data move across platforms. And in doing so, take advantage of the affordances of the ecosystem as a whole. Now, this is where our next project really comes in. You know, we were then fortunate enough to receive some funding from the Resolve Network to undertake conceptual and empirical research into how online ecosystem thinking can be turned into an analytical framework to investigate dynamic extremist online environments. Now, this project is still ongoing. It involves a review of both terrorism and also media and communication studies literature on digital ecosystem thinking. And also it involves devising a conceptual framework to better think about and to study online environments and the testing of this across our data set. And so I'm now going to pass over to Jade, who's going to tell a bit more about that project.
Thanks. So the first half of the project consisted of a systemic conceptual literature review, as Julian mentioned, and here we drew on a corpus of 263 sources to plot the use of the terms ecosystem and ecology throughout various disciplines. And here we tried to chronologically categorize each source for its historical and its conceptual relevance to the intellectual tradition of ecology, yes, but also to gauge its utility to terrorism and violent extremism studies. So our aim was try to understand some fundamental issues like where and when did these terms first appear in the literature? Why were these terms or related concepts adopted by the disciplines or fields? What are the limits of using these ideas and concepts? And then try to identify points of departure from which online violent extremism ecosystem could potentially be examined in a more rigorous analytical and empirical manner. But due to time limitations, we can only offer a few findings, and we can return if necessary during question time, but in short, or an overview, ecology is a branch of biological sciences that seeks to investigate how organisms interact with one another and with their physical surroundings. What emerged out of the relationship between ecology and adjacent disciplines like psychology and physics and mathematics and computer science was this term, ecosystems. And ecosystem thinking, it sought to culture a holistic perspective on ever expanding networks comprised of biotic and abiotic beings, yet in fine detail instill a precise mode of analysis to comprehend their systemic interaction and the nature of their development. However, within the field of terrorism and violent extremism, these terms and their related concepts are largely used as a metaphor or a classification system to map the digital environment. And despite their potential as being or analytical utility, beyond their just descriptive or current metaphorical use, ecosystem is largely untheorized in investigations of violent extremism and how it might emerge from digital environments. Again, as Julian mentioned, there remain fundamental gaps in understanding these benefits and limitations in concepts to analyze online right-wing extremist communities. So after reviewing the intellectual history and hallmarks of ecology and ecosystem thinking, we turn to consider whether certain concepts provided a useful analytical window into right-wing extremist online environments that are characterized by complexity and networks and dynamism. So here, our literature review highlighted the term ecosystem as it was presented in the natural sciences as composed as several characteristics or component processes that can be used in an analytical manner to provide insights into the operation of these communities. Three of those that were commonly cited in the literature and have possible application when considering these online systems are illustrated on the current slide. So here, network refers to a series of interconnected things contained within a hierarchy of systems that then compose the ecosystem, but it also connotes an assembly, right, of scalable, interconnected ecosystems. And this implies a kind of interdependence, between agents and shared environments, but it does not reveal much about the nature or consequence of their interaction or relationship. Dynamism is the ability to remain agile and resilient against disturbances, and also considered an important property of ecosystem sustainability. But to better understand this dynamism, we sort of thought we need to attend to multiple layered dynamics as opposed to working with just a single layer or remaining with a single snapshot of a system. Classification is the establishment of a hierarchy of systems or categories among organisms and their environment. And as we know, these kinds of classification systems are used to reduce complexity and to help establish structure. And within ecosystem, it is highly elastic and useful in analyzing complex online systems made up of these sort of interactive, very dynamic networks of human and technological forces. Information systems that support right-wing extremist communities, however, are rapidly changing, as previous panelists noted. And the ability to then classify these online ecosystems are wedded to this technological foundation that we're all sort of chasing to understand. And it's this pace of evolution that makes long-standing systems of classifications very difficult. But regardless, it is through these sort of discrete examinations that we can sort of begin to address complexity. And complexity in this case refers to this sort of emergent quality from self-organizing and heterogeneous networks of these agents or actors. And as we know, complexity often features as a sort of descriptor of networked media or a sort of shorthand to understand the quality of information systems, or is at times just partnered with evolutionary theory, right, to understand how complexity might emerge over time. And that concept is called succession by itself. But however, in conjunction with other component processes, we can try to understand what complexity means, right, in these component processes that underlie them. So in the second phase of this research project, we tried to test some of the insights generated by this conceptual review, and I'll let Lise, again, tell you a little bit more about this next stage.
Thanks very much, Jade. So it was really fascinating to hear from Maura about the importance of integrating different knowledge sets, and particularly those that draw from internet studies and computational science in investigations of extremism online. And this is something I think that characterizes the work that we have been doing in the studies that Julian has alluded to and into other studies. And so when we started to examine the Gab and Twitter data sets in particular, and you can read more about that in the open source publication that we placed on Xanadu, we were struck by the numerous interconnections, not just between the platforms themselves, but also between mainstream media communications and what Maura described, I think, aptly as the tech stacks. And so conceptual framings of networks, I think, from ecosystem thinking is particularly useful here. And we see this in a number of different ways. So firstly, often people talk about groups online, but actually outside of Facebook and arguably more recently, Telegram, we didn't really characterize the networks in this way. We felt that it was more appropriate than what we'd seen from the data, where less groups operating online, but networks of socially connected individuals that shared and engaged across diverse social media platforms. And the behaviors of those interactions were shaped by world events, the specificities of moderation on platform and on a specific group or space in the platform, and the layers of technology and structures and architecture and that facilitates or restrict engagement in the digital environment. And one of the really interesting findings that's emerged can be seen in the graph on the right-hand side under Gab activity. There's tweet activity per day. And what we saw is that absolutely the Christchurch attack and references to Gab in reporting around that attack caused a spike in engagement on activity, on the platform. But what was really interesting was we suddenly saw this much more significant, not statistically, but significant increase in activity around June 2019. And then we realized that what had happened at that point, and what actually happened was that it reflects Gab's decision to fork the source code of Mastodon's decentralized network. And this created significant mainstream media reporting about that decision and the impact on Mastodon, on other users of that decentralized network, and on Gab itself. What it did was call attention to and drive engagement to the platform. Now, as Jade's already referenced, looking at the network in and of itself, it doesn't really tell us anything about the consequence or the impact. And so we can move on to another aspect that we'd like to explore. And we're going to explore this in more detail in the resolve empirical stage of the project. And so as Jade's already discussed, one core element of ecosystem thinking that we think that we could be able to test empirically is the intersection of networks and complexity. And so, as I've already said, this work is derived from our mapping work funded by Communities and Justice here in New South Wales. And so the way in which we're going to engage and test this explore this notion of complexity is through an analysis of hyperlinks that are found in our Twitter and Gab dataset. Hyperlinks provide fascinating insights into multi-platform behavior. It talks to engagement, sharing of content, and community. So YouTube was without doubt the most frequently hyperlinked platform in the dataset. Now this reflects and necessitates an understanding of YouTube as a platform in and of itself. Obviously, YouTube acts in two primary ways. It acts as an archiving repository for video content, and also as a place of curated social community. And so when moderation occurs, for example, on Twitter or on any other platform, links, hyperlinks, provide a useful way to point towards engaging and often controversial content. Now, this can either be discussed under the video itself on YouTube, if YouTube community moderation, like the channel allows that, or if YouTube allows that, or it can be discussed on other platforms such as Gab or messaging boards such as Reddit, 4chan, etc. So essentially, it's really difficult to understand engagement with content and social networks in the space unless you start to look at it through this lens of tech stack or complexity. And so finally, one of the things that we have also tried to do is think about classification and how we can classify much of this complexity in meaningful ways. And this is just one example that we have been playing around with over the past couple of years, based on our data. Essentially, what we sought to do was look at how both the specificities of the platform architecture and the norms around moderation enacted by the platform and users, as well as user behavior, all intersect and help us think about how we can use classification meaningfully. So in this example that you can see, we have classified the platforms that we were exploring in the data along two levels. The first is the strength of the echo chamber. So there's a lot of research, for example, Bright's research on Gab, that talks about understanding difference in echo chamber. And we absolutely saw that in our research. We saw that echo chambers on Twitter are very different to those on Gab. On Twitter and even on YouTube, we see a lot of shouting at each other and therefore exposure to alternative perspective, even if it's in a negative sense. But on Gab, the echo chamber and other platforms such as 4chan and 8chan, it's more siloed. You are more likely only to encounter supporting and extending narratives and beliefs. Also, the level of moderation that occurs on the site is extremely different and important to understand when you're classifying those sites. Now, that's notwithstanding the fact that moderation isn't necessarily effective at either reducing content or engagement with narratives, beliefs, and said content. So this has been essentially some of the emerging ways that we are thinking about taking that really important theoretical framing and applying it to various different data sets.
Yeah, thanks, Lise. And so where are we now? Basically, our review of the literature suggests that there are further characteristics related to the concept of ecosystem that we can take out of it. This idea of ecosystem that comes, originally out of natural sciences may be able to be broken down further into component processes that collectively allow ecosystems to operate in the natural world. Some of these components or processes we think we might also be able to use in an empirical way, looking at online data as the beginning for falsifiable hypothesis testing. These components, you can see them in the image on the screen. We've got network, dynamism, and complexity and classification, which we already talked to and we're already identifying in the data. But what we're wondering about now is whether we can start to see more complex processes that rely on feedback chains between these earlier ones. And these more complex feedback mediated processes of things like self-organization, which we often see within populations of extremist groups or milieus when they move from platform to platform, for instance, after particular platforms are moderated. Evolution as well, changing and adapting to the environment, the platform architecture changes in various ways. Adaptation, swarm intelligence, which is also that idea of groups of people to act in predictable ways and complex ways to solve challenges, and also nonlinear behavior and even emergence. Emergence, of course, we think is the big question here, since it's so much of the terrorist and violent extremist issues we've been facing over the past 10 years don't just happen on the internet, but they emerge out from the internet. So potential to better understand these online ecosystems, better conceptualize how those processes of digital extremism, if you like, and the extremist communities inhabiting these spaces, emerge out of these areas. Now, these 10 components, they certainly provide a framework for applying ecosystem thinking in an analytical manner to reveal how extremist populations operate online. We acknowledge absolutely that there are huge limitations and also risks associated with using biological analogies and processes from the natural sciences, such as the ecosystem itself, when we start to think about and analyze online systems. There are big differences between online spaces that are created by people, that are impacted by things like economics and politics and so on, government regulation, to, you know, quote unquote natural processes out there in the natural world. And we'll be happy to talk about some of the limitations. You know, we're really proposing these theories as ways to create ongoing empirical studies and to think about the problems in more conceptually rigorous ways. Several of the components are certainly open to empirical testing across our and other data sets. And that's where we're currently at with this project. So we're looking forward to updating you as we go forward. And I'll finish there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian and team, for the excellent presentation. It's going to be a great Q&A session, I'm sure. I will start with a question for Ryan. From Mia. So we seem to have a black box between online activity and real world harm. I know, Ryan, you have done lots of research on this. So have you identified the online to offline transcendence, since the vast majority of people who post or engage in violence and many people who engage in online violent activity and do not engage in real violence, and people who engage in real violence sometimes have never posted, although of course there might be a leakage ahead of time by lone actors. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, I mean, that's the $1 million question. With my colleagues, I've started to try to develop a body of literature trying to really connect the on and offline world of violent right-wing extremists. In a recent piece we wrote, we have some really interesting data. We have data from known violent extremists and data from known non-violent extremists, and we compare those two samples, their online posting behaviors in particular. We are seeing some patterns. The data is not great, but it's a start. One thing we are seeing is that, and I guess to me it's no surprise really, the violent right-wing extremists are those who are not as active online as the non-violent extremists. Like, no surprise, right? I mean, they're engaging in violence offline. They're doing things that they shouldn't be doing, and a lot of them are fearful that I'd assume that they're going to be infiltrated by law enforcement. And I'm making that connection based on other work that I've done, where I've conducted in-depth interviews with former members of racist skinhead groups, and they said to me, so one of the series of questions we're asking them to connect their on and offline worlds, how their worlds were intertwined, and what we overwhelmingly found is that there were connections. I mean, people were trying to connect and communicate with people online to then connect offline through shared events, whether it was like concerts, whether it was rallies, that type of thing. We also noticed that the more violent individuals that we interviewed were pretty concerned about their online presence. They were, this is like the older guard, so they were going to like internet cafes when that was a thing back in the day. They were going to the public libraries to post messages or whatever. So we are seeing that dynamic. But I guess the short of it, Mia, is we really don't know a lot as of right now. I currently have a paper under review where I've compared the online the posting patterns of violent and non-violent extremists and compared them with a sample of people who post in the same space to see whether there are differences, not just between violent and non-violent right-wing extremists, but to the general population that posts there as well. And I still am seeing similar patterns in terms of the non-violent tend to be the mouthpieces. The random sample tend to post quite a bit, but not as much as the non-violent. And then the violent folks they're not hush-hush or quiet by any means, but they aren't as vocal as the others. And they don't talk about, they don't express the same level of ideological sentiment, and they don't try to mobilize people to violent extremism offline. But I mean, that's a key area of research that people are trying to wrap their heads around. The big challenge is trying to get data, right? I've done some work with colleagues, folks like Paul Gill and others have used data from, I believe, they gained access to data through, and Kurt could probably speak to this more than I did. I believe they had court records of people who were convicted of terrorism, and then they looked at their online behaviors and their offline behaviors. But aside from that research, there's really not a lot in that space. So I suggest that we start moving in that regard if we can.
Thank you, Ryan. Absolutely. I have a question for Kurt, which is, do you think that subversive online activity captures something that, for example, Paul Gill in his latest research found, like, having a thrill-seeking personality, or negative attitudes to norms and legislation?
I could definitely see it having some kind of connection to an aversion to norms. Even if there are norms that aren't actually held by these individuals, a lot of them, I think, tend to like to project as though they are kind of going against the grain. They like being a subculture and engage in these activities as a way for them to kind of operationalize that subculture. So it wouldn't surprise me in the least if there was some connection between the subversive online activity, excuse me, and those sorts of outcomes. We did see that the subversive online activity factor, and you wouldn't be surprised by it, is that they were correlated with some of the other control variables we saw, the right-wing authoritarianism and things like that, which was unsurprising. So that is another way to identify kind of what they're into and who they are. It's important to note, though, that this wasn't longitudinal. So I don't mean to say that subversive online activity it causes the persuasion by. It might be that persuadability by this stuff predicts somebody actually engaging in these activities. So it's not directional. I'm very careful to say as such in the paper, but there are some hints there, correlational hints, and hints we get from these regression analyses that show us who these people are. There's another study that I have that, incidentally, while I was giving my talk, I got distracted for a second because my phone bleeped because it finally just got done being reviewed. Showing, we looked at different personality traits. We looked at the dark tetrad, narcissism, Machiavellianism, and those sorts of things, to see whether or not people were persuaded by, it wasn't right-wing propaganda, it was just terrorist propaganda taken from the Hamas website, but it was anonymized, so you wouldn't know it was from Hamas, and showed that something that actually made somebody more susceptible to being persuaded by it was Machiavellianism, the tendency to see other people as a means to an end. So that was something we didn't expect, but it was pretty consistent across the data. So it wouldn't surprise me if something like Machiavellianism was tied to this subversive online activity, because the people who engage in it get that gratification from engaging in it. It wouldn't surprise me if they see other people as a means of getting that gratification. So there are a lot of variables to look at here, some related to online behavior, some I really advocate into looking at the way personality traits interact with the way people engage with messages. So there's a lot of room here, as Ryan said at the outset, to explore some of these issues.
Thank you, Kurt. I have a question for Julian, Lise, Jade, and Brian. In your opinion, what is the most useful unit of analysis of the online extremist ecosystem? I mean, do you think it's groups, either formal or informal, or clusters of people? Do you think it's individuals, it's platforms, content?
Yeah,
I mean, I think I'll speak to that.
We have Brian with us here too, Brian Ballsun-Stanton, who is our digital scientist and solutions architect, who can also answer, any technical questions that anyone has. I think your question is interesting around what is the most useful datum that we can use. First I'd point back to Maura's keynote this morning, where she looked at those 3 different levels. The micro level, the intermediate level, and the macro level. Probably a useful way, I think, to think about how we can do effective research in these highly complex spaces. In terms of what we focus on, though, I think part of the answer to that, Matteo, is what we can get, because, as academic researchers, we're very limited, in what we can, scrape of particular servers. We're limited to what particular servers we can get data off in the first place. But when we do scrape data off these servers, we have to anonymize it, and we anonymize it at source. So no, information about individuals actually comes onto our servers. So we're not really able to track individuals, across platforms. It's not possible at the moment. What we instead are looking at is the effects of individuals. So we're looking at things like, as Lise mentioned, hyperlinks or outlinks to other platforms. We can look at themes and narratives. We can look at memes. And I think all of those data are very useful. We're trying to understand, groups of individuals. I don't think looking at terror groups is particularly useful. As Lise mentioned, these are not particularly prevalent online on most platforms. It's more groups of people who are connected socially. But yeah.
Yeah, no. I think one of the things that people have struggled with before is the interconnection. We end up looking at a single platform, but one of the important things I think that our study, previous study and this current study and our other work that we're doing, like large-scale YouTube and Twitter research, it shows the importance of actually layering them on top of each other. So I think it is problematic to look at a single component because there's so very many different variables. That's why I think a lens of investigation, like Julian's alluded to, that has those different layers, that provides insight at different points to grapple with dynamism, complexity, network, their interconnection, is always going to, I think, be more valuable.
At the end of the day, you go where the data is, and platforms are making it harder and harder to get data out of them, right? Facebook loves to talk about sharing up until the point where they want to share. And so it's this lovely Kafka-esque dance, which wastes time. Gab has changed their terms of service to forbid any research on the platform. And so when our ethics requires that we follow terms of service and our clients are unwilling to ask us to violate terms of service, because ethics is totally happy with us violating terms of service if we have a request to do so, we kind of have to go where the data is, but that risks the street lamp effect, right? If we go looking for this content, we've proven time and time again that we will find it on whatever platform you want to look at. And then it's a question of, well, is this the normal experience? What questions are we answering? What questions are we asking? And then what and the danger here is what generalizations does our data support? Because I think a tendency here is to get a lovely, rich, super qualitative data sample and go, great, now I'm going to generalize to the platform. And that's where the danger is. So it depends, the more networks you have in a related set, the better. And we just need to be temperate on what questions we're answering.
Yeah, I mean, at least I can speak to, the ways in which these concepts and terms have evolved over time to shape, our perceptions of whatever we consider to be an ecosystem in that moment, right? I mean, these concepts and terms, their popularity outside of biology is, particularly because they are, once they escape biology, as it were, they are immediately distilled into analogies and metaphors, and they essentially acquire just a very general meaning, right? It's just the study of systemic relationships between organisms and environments. But, as it goes through, this process of being distilled, and suddenly the term organism and environment is opened up for classification, suddenly you can sort of just put anything you like in that formula, and it's immense elasticity, as an idea, can then lead us to, perhaps only look at, those things that we consider to be important in that time, or, as we've noted, just because we're simply restricted by the practical purposes of gaining data at all, right? So it really is a kind of framework, right, that needs to be accompanied, by a significant series of considerations in order to draw insight from what we think is most important.
Thanks. So, and look, I agree, and I also think it's not only a problem of qualitative research, but also quantitative research with big data. As we all know, everything is more or less statistically significant. So, what's important? That remains a question. A question to Ryan from the audience. Although there is limited research into the extent of financing of right-wing extremism, what do we know about how prevalent it is? What research did you find?
Not much. That's it. We wrote this piece. It's gone through a couple iterations, but the latest version was submitted a couple months ago. But I haven't read the piece yet, but work by like folks like Megan Squire. She's working with folks at Southern Poverty Law Center to try and track funding or financing of the extreme right. Aside from that work, there's really not much. From my understanding is these different groups and movements, they try to use these different platforms and then get kicked off and then try to sign up for another and get kicked off and then sign up for another and kicked off. But I'll be honest, I'm not an expert in that particular area of research. So I would suggest that you go look at the work of Megan Squire, or I believe Jessica Davis just brought out a book on terrorist financing. She could probably answer that question better than I could.
Thanks, Ryan. Quick question for Kurt. Do you think inoculation moderates the effect of subversive online activity on the outcome?
On the ones we looked at, it didn't. We looked at some interactions between inoculation condition and subversive online activity, treated as a like a high-low variable, 1-0, and we didn't see an interaction. So there didn't seem to be a moderation there. Now that said, the trend, it wasn't significant, but the trend was that those who engage in it may be less responsive to inoculation than those who don't engage in subversive online activity. So although it wasn't significant, it would suggest that the way the numbers trended would suggest that they might have a little more resistance to the inoculation treatment than those who were low in the SOA variable. So it's another one of those factors where it probably depends on another variable in there, and we'll start seeing three-way interactions and make them even more difficult to interpret.
Very interesting, because it makes sense in theory that we find an interaction. Julian, Lise, Jade, and Brian, very quick, we have 3 minutes left, but I would like to pick your brain about the boundaries of the online extremist ecosystem. You mentioned, mainstream media, mainstream political parties. Are they different environments? Are they different actors? Where does the ecosystem begins and where it ends?
Look, I think it's a really important question. And actually, I think making those decisions at the beginning of your study is a really important part of ensuring that your findings are somewhat rigorous. I think that whichever boundaries you create are fictitious. To think of the digital environment as something separate to the real world is just not supported by any of the research on internet studies or even media and communication. Like, this is a blended world that we live in, and that people don't use the internet in isolation of what's happening in the real world. And I think to make very clear articulation about what each study is including and is not including helps to bound and appropriately frame your analysis. So in this case, in this study, because of our prior engagement in the environment, Gab and Twitter, we were very aware about the importance of mainstream media. Now, I should qualify that by mainstream media consumed through online platforms, not likely somebody buying the paper or reading. It is it's mainstream media that falls within the online environment. And I think that you can also think about mainstream political parties and how they are communicating through, again, specific digital platforms. And again, that goes back to which ones will you leave out? So if you're going to leave out the television programs, well, actually, many of them link to their channels on YouTube or other platforms, etc. So I don't think there's any clear answer. I think it's up to each study to articulate, but I think that the question is really important because it makes you as a researcher set those artificial but important boundaries to the scope of your research.
I can add there on how we actually did it in this study. In this study, we did it through snowballing. So we began with seed accounts on Twitter and Gab, and we knew from independent subject area expertise that these particular accounts were associated with the Australian right-wing extremist culture. And then we were able to snowball out from that through numbers of connections. And we chose a certain number of connections to snowball out through, and then we got our sample. And that's a sample from which we map this ecosystem on. And so I guess, again, in some ways, these naturalistic analogies, it's not too dissimilar to what someone out in the natural world will do when they're trying to create their artificial ecosystem boundaries. Because if you look at the world, all the ecosystems are also connected, on the planet, but you choose a species or something like that, and you create an ecosystem around that species, and it's rather artificial. So that's how we did it. It's not the only way to do it, but that's how we did it in this study.
Thank you, everyone. I think we are at the end of our time, but really outstanding presentations. Thanks to everyone who attended this morning. We now have a 10 minutes break. And we will be back at 10:40 for the next panel on violent extremist recruitment. See you all then. Bye.